Boston, Prabhupada's visits, and the installation of Radha Gopivallabha. Can you hear me?
Yes, Maharaj.
Yes. So actually, preaching in Boston began in September 1965 when Prabhupada arrived at the Commonwealth Pier. He wrote that beautiful poem, "Let me dance, let me dance, let me dance." And then he went to New York City. And established a small group of serious disciples. In 1967, some disciples from 26 Second Avenue went to Boston to attend what's called a be-in at Franklin Park. For those of you who don't remember what a be-in is, in the 1960s, they were very popular with the hippies. They would gather in some park by the hundreds, and there would be no particular purpose. Perhaps the purpose was protesting Vietnam War or protesting laws against marijuana. But they had no real purpose in being there together. So the devotees who went to Boston started a kirtan, and all the other hippies gathered and joined in the kirtan. It was a great success. The devotees went back to Prabhupada and reported to him. And he was very happy. And he said we should start a center in Boston. He was in New York, but on his way to India to recuperate his health. I was chosen to go to Boston alone and try to start something. He asked me to sound off the big cannon of Hare Krishna. So I went in advance to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and tried to get a job. I was working in the welfare office in New York City. Now I wanted to transfer to Boston or Cambridge. And one day I got a new assignment there. So I was thrilled at my success. I went back to Prabhupada and said, I got the job. He corrected me and he said, by Krishna's grace. I was taking the credit. So I moved there by myself. My job wasn't to start until a few weeks. Then Brahmananda from New York sent me a couple of devotees, a devotee named Damodar, a devotee named Jodharani Dasi, and another devotee came and joined us on his own, a junior. So there were 3 of us. We started out very small. We rented a small storefront across the street from the big apartment buildings that were filled with students from Boston University. One day I went to check out the storefront. I used my key and opened the door. The room was completely bare, but on the floor, a few feet into the room, I saw a blue aerogram. It was from India. It seemed to me a kind of miracle that it could have traveled all the way from India and landed through the mail slot onto the floor of our storefront. It was from Prabhupada himself. He wished me blessings for the endeavor in Boston and said it would probably be good there because of the large volume of students. So I was very encouraged by that aerogram. Prabhupada himself came to Boston in 1968 in May, and he stayed a month. We had many college engagements for him. He appreciated that. He stayed in a house that we rented that was 9 blocks away from the storefront. He used to walk to the storefront to give classes when he wasn't giving a college class. There were 2 outstanding things he did in the month of May in Boston. One was his giving of the first Brahmin initiations in ISKCON. One day, Prabhupada said that he would be giving some of his disciples Brahmana, second initiation. He would award the Gayatri Mantra, sacred thread, those men who had been initiated for at least 1 year. The devotees wanted to know more about the initiation. Prabhupada said he would accept, he would explain everything at the ceremony. There would be a fire sacrifice. Prabhupada entered the room, taking his seat on the pillow on the floor, directly before the mound of earth. He began to explain how his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had introduced political initiation for disciples not born of Brahmin families. He said the Vedic scriptures offer much evidence that by associating with pure devotees, anyone could become a Brahmana. In fact, the scripture said that if one born in a Brahmin family did not behave as a Brahmana, he should not be accepted as a Brahmana. So it was in following his spiritual master, the Vedic scriptures, that Srila Prabhupada was now going to give medical initiation to his disciples. About 6 men were given Brahmin initiation for the first time. The next morning, he told Sundar and Govinda Dasi, his secretaries, husband and wife, but he saw no harm in offering the Gayatri mantra to women. They could not perceive the sacred thread. That very night, he held a separate ceremony, initiating Govinda Dasi and Jodharani to the Gayatri mantra. A few days later, a group of devotees came from New York. Prabhupada initiated more Brahmanas. One morning when he saw a group of new Brahmana initiates coming to join him, on his walk he said, "Oh, here come the Brahmanas. Now don't be Brahmanas in name only." Another outstanding thing that happened in that month that he was in Boston, 1968, was that he accepted the name Prabhupada. Up to then we had called him Swamiji with great affection. It was in Swamiji's room one day on Hare Krishna Street that he accepted the name Prabhupada. While Govinda Dasi was taking dictation, Prabhupada mentioned that the affix G was a third-class address. "Then why do we call you Swami G?" she asked. "What should we call you?" "The spiritual master," Prabhupada replied, "is usually addressed by names like Gurudev, Vishnupad, or Prabhupada. May we call you Prabhupada? She asked. Yes. And Govinda Dasi told the others. At first, some of the devotees were reluctant to give up the long-cherished Swamiji. For them was a name of affection. I heard we shouldn't use the name Swamiji anymore, one of the boys asked on a morning walk. Who said? Prabhupada replied quickly. They said, you said it was third class and we shouldn't say it. I never said that. Then can we use it? Yes, that is all right. But Swamiji soon disappeared. Ray Rama even printed an explanation in Back to Godhead. Prabhupada. He described how the word is used for very elevated devotees. And Rupa Goswami and the Goswamis are called Prabhupada. Then he wrote, our spiritual master, Om Vishnupad 108, Sri Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, has in the same way executed the will of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada in carrying the message of love of Krishna to the Western world. And therefore the humble servants of his divine grace from all the centers in the Sankirtan movement are following in the footsteps of Srila Rupa Goswami Prabhupada and prefer to address his grace, our spiritual master, as Prabhupada. And he has kindly said, yes. So it was a wonderful month with so much personal association. Then Prabhupada came again in 1971 at my request that he initiate devotees and install Radha Krishna deities. I wrote a poem about his coming to Boston in July 1971. I called it Lessons in Boston. When I paid in advance for the top floor suite, she gave me a long-stemmed rose and asked, spend so much for your guru. It is our small expression of love, I explained. He is a pure devotee of God, and all should treat him with honor. But Prabhupada would not accept it. The hotel is like a brothel, he said, and the temple is Vaikuntha. Another visit to Boston was not important compared to his worldwide preaching, but we had been begging him for a year to please bring Radha and Krishna and initiate some followers. But he was disappointed to find a broken window pane and on the front lawn, yellow grass. I had excuses why the overflowing paint can he saw from his room was not a waste, but was due to the rain. Never mind, he said. We obtain everything at great labor, so do not waste Krishna's energy. According to Jiva Goswami, he said, before a room full of Indians, this boy is fit to perform the Agnihotra because he is chanting Hare Krishna. I sat beside him as he guided me in arranging ghee, yogurt, and milk, and allowed me to pour the liquids on the heads of Radha and Gopivallabha, the golden forms standing before us. His annihilating glance when I omitted a mantra during the yajna. What have you done? I thought it wasn't so bad and had no answer why. Why have you done this? He insisted. And from his piercing, hurt glance, I read, don't you know that Brahma with sacred trust whimsically change? How can I let you carry the charge if this is what you do? While still in his view, I stumbled to rectify and prayed to keep the lesson. At his order, I carried their heavy lordships dressed in their new greenish clothes. I placed him light-footed on the altar with young Radha standing by his side. What are they saying about them? Prabhupada asked. We are all very happy, I replied. Travel with Prabhupada as much as you can, my wife advised. See everything he does, how he moves, because a pure devotee is very rare. And when will you again get such a chance? With 40 Boston devotees, I saw him off and danced before him at the airport, chanting Hare Krishna for his smiling pleasure. Farewell, Srila Prabhupada. But we will soon catch up and see you in another place, if only from distance, to behold your regal New York pastimes. When the younger disciples need our care, and the temple needs repair, so we shall follow you shortly. We cannot thank you enough for stopping to bring us Radha and Krishna, and teaching us how to cherish our humble temple at Vaikuntha. Please forgive us for offering you such a bare room and such an unprepared, meager heart, and forgive us for these unmeasured, flowery words. All we have is your service. We beg that you keep us as atoms at your lotus feet, and let us work despite our reluctance. I have another reminiscence from my autobiography, the story of my life. During his 1971 visit to Boston, when he stayed in the Temple building, he called me into his room. It was raining heavily outside, and he wanted to bring my attention to something in the backyard. He pointed to a paint can that was overflowing with water, and he told me not to waste paint. I told him that there was no waste of paint, that the can was empty, that it was just water overflowing. All right, he conceded. It may be just water, but I'm telling you not to waste paint. All right, I said, accepting the lesson, but wanting him to be convinced that there hadn't been any waste of paint. He repeated that he accepted that the can held only water, but in any case, you should not waste Krishna's paint. I was thankful that he called me in for a little meeting and reminded me to be responsible about our property and belongings. He didn't have anything else to say, and he let me go. I told the other devotees what Prabhupada had said. It was more nectar, anything he did. I like to think of him looking out the window and seeing the paint can overflowing and deciding to call me in, tell me not to waste. They're asking me to speak louder. Move this closer. What's that book again? Right on the straight.
It doesn't have to go.
Put the other one on top. The other one on top.
You don't need it so high.
No, it's okay. Now fix the. They're adjusting the computer. I like to think of him looking out the window and seeing the paint can overflowing and deciding to call me in and tell me not to waste. He had come to install the Radha Krishna deities. The night after he did it, we were kneeling side by side, and he turned his head to me and asked me, "What are they saying about the deities?" Such a nice question. I told him, everyone thinks they are beautiful, and he was satisfied. During that visit, an Indian man who had been inimical to us visited him. He had a young wife who came to the temple against his will and associated with the women in the art department. She said her husband used to beat her for coming to Krishna. Once he came looking for his wife, and I told him she wasn't there. But then he saw her raincoat hanging on the wardrobe rack. He called me a liar and a cheat and said I wasn't a Brahmana. I was hesitant to let him have a darshan with Prabhupada, but he was insistent. When he came into Prabhupada's presence, he didn't speak anything about his wife, but just asked a few formal philosophical questions and gave Prabhupada a small check. Prabhupada said that by his last name, he could tell he was a Vaishya, and Vaishyas were stingy. I then told Prabhupada about his wife coming to the temple against his will. He made no comment. Later, the man divorced his wife, and she moved to the New York temple and became a wonderful devotee named Sunita. When Prabhupada used the bathroom, he had to go out of his main room and walk down the busy hallway to reach the bathroom. One time, Patita Pavana, who was eccentric, was standing outside the bathroom with Somadas. They both raised their arms and shouted, "Prabhupada ki jai!" Then he smiled and returned. When he came out of the bathroom, dressed in a gamsha and holding a lota, they shouted again, "Prabhupada ki jai!" In his memoirs of that moment, Somadas said he was impressed by how simple and gracious and pleased Prabhupada was by their behavior. Prabhupada went out of his way to have little exchanges with everyone he met. Like a loving father, he asked the mothers how they were doing, and he asked the men how they liked their service. By these little conversations, he endeared the devotees to him, and they bonded. At this time in his life, Prabhupada was traveling in India with a group of devotees and holding pandals. And he had recently been to Moscow and Paris. It was his kindness to stop and visit Boston, which was now a smaller temple with the exodus of devotees of ISKCON Press. He went out of his way to come, and I've always felt it was a personal reciprocation just to do the favor of rewarding me for sticking it out in Boston. And he was rewarding the temple for persevering. Besides, we had about 20 devotees ready for him to initiate. And I had written him several times, asking him to come to install the deities. He had personally purchased them in India. They were identical to the Radha brass deities he had installed in Mayapur. We had 2 separate sacrifices, one for the initiations and one for installing the deities. Here I am functioning as a priest in my householder dress, and Prabhupada is looking on. He read from the verses of Brahma Samhita. It was during this visit that I made the mistake of renting the VIP suite at the Boston Sheraton for Prabhupada to use as his rooms. We did not have first-class facilities at the temple and didn't prepare a room for him. We also had only one men's bathroom. That was used by all the men, and the women had their own. When Prabhupada first arrived, he came to the temple and lectured and met with the devotees afterwards. Then I informed him he was late. He could go to the hotel he had carefully prepared for him. He flatly refused. He quoted the saying that living in the forest was living in the mode of goodness. Living in a city was living in the mode of passion. And living in the brothel or liquor house was living in the mode of ignorance. When I had paid for the hotel, the lady asked me why we were getting the VIP suite for a spiritual master if he was a renounced person. She even supplied long-stemmed roses. There was no cooking in the room. We planned to smuggle in an electric burner. I told her that our spiritual master was the most important person to us and deserved the best treatment. But it turned out I had missed out on the concept of Yukta Vairagya in this case. And I was trying to put my spiritual master in what he considered brothel. The room at the temple was very simple, and all we had for a chair was a rocking chair. And it was sometimes a little awkward with our making the men and women share the second bathroom in the house. but he seemed to accept it all without any disturbance and liked staying at the temple. And he left Boston and went to New York, where they had lavished quarters for him in the temple. He wrote him a letter of apology for giving such run-down quarters in Boston. He wrote back and said there was nothing to apologize for. He was a mendicant, he said, and accepted whatever his disciples could offer. But the principle should be to present the first class. I was relieved he was angry for the way I had given him first class facilities. One of my hundreds sent me a paper describing the small Radha Krishna deities and how they came to Boston. During Srila Prabhupada's manifest pastimes, at one time in Sri Vrindavan Dham, His Divine Grace was donated 3 sets of Radha Krishna deities from one Mr. Pioneer, a patron life member. One set of deities went to Berkeley, one to Boston, and Srila Prabhupada kept the other set with himself. This set of deities was to become our small Radhamadava, Chota Radhamadava. I received these deities in the mail from India. I used to do the deity worship myself. I had an apartment across the street from the storefront. And early in the morning, I would come down to the storefront and worship the deities. I would massage them, and bathe them, and dress them. And we had made a little altar for them. They were our deities during his 1968 visit. When Srila Prabhupada was in Allahabad, he once chanted a song of Bhaktivinoda Thakur to Chota Radhamadava. Jai Radhamadava Kunja Bihari. After he sang the first 2 lines, he fell into a trance, and he came back to external consciousness after some time. He remarked that this song depicted Vrindavan. Everything is there. Srimati Radharani, Krishna, Govardhan, Yasoda, all the cowherd boys and gopis. I'm glad I could share some memories with you of Prabhupada's early visits to Boston. That's all I have.